Rather an appropriate walk-on song for our next session on what's the risk, climate change, and water scarcity. We're going to start in a minute after we finish our espressos, one of the more water-efficient forms of coffee. But seriously, the only thing less predictable than the weather has been food costs for our industry, at least in recent years, as Russ Walker talked about earlier this morning. But the weather and food costs are intertwined as each year's harvest is shaped by the weather and the availability of water. Given the situation in California or in Brazil that's unfolding this season, it's also connected to a historic lack of water along with a lack of clarity on how to prioritize the use of limited water resources that are available, or what those of us in the food service industry should or even could be doing. Our next session will explore how risks from climate change and water scarcity are affecting the food service industry today, along with strategies for managing the cost and supply of food and protecting our water resources and our businesses in the coming years. And to help us, we're going to be joined by two of the nation's experts on understanding and managing water risk. Will Sarni, Director of Enterprise Water Strategy for Deloitte Consulting, and Thomas Harter, who is the Robert M. Hagan Endowed Chair in Water Management and Policy at the University of California, Davis. First, I'd like to welcome Will Sarni. Will, as I mentioned, is the Director of Enterprise Water Strategy at Deloitte, where he focuses on developing and implementing corporate-wide sustainability and water strategies. Will's diverse client list includes Fortune 500 companies, multinational corporations, and non-governmental organizations. He also leads the Deloitte team on the annual Interbrand Best Global Green Brands Sustainability Performance Ranking, which highlights the value of sustainability in creating brand value or value for businesses. He's an internationally recognized thought leader on sustainability and corporate water strategies. He is the author of Corporate Water Strategies and Water Tech, a guide to innovation investment and also business opportunities in the water sector. And he's currently working on his next book, due out, I think, next week, 21st Century Growth, Beyond Energy, Water, Food, Nexus. Will Sarni.
I'm a little speechless after the Eddie Money, Arlin, Wasserman intro. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Almost nothing better than talking about my favorite subject, water, to people that love food. So what I'm going to do is give you a bit of an overview of what are the risks and the business opportunities. So this is not a superbug impacted tree on the left here. It's meant to illustrate the risk side of the equation, which we all face really in every sector, but in particular in consumer products and the food and beverage sector. And try and get you to think about, well, this is a risk to my business, but I need to be really the right side of the tree. And how do I thrive in a world where there's increasing water scarcity, water quality issues that are impacting my direct operations, how my consumers use my products, but more importantly, the agricultural supply chain. So hopefully I can end on a high note at the end and give you pause for some optimism about tackling this risk issue. So like every consultant, I have way too many slides for 15 minutes, so I want to go through them quickly, and we'll take it from there. So this is a projection of water scarcity in 2025. A few statistics here. By 2025, 2/3 of the world's population will be living in water stress or water scarce areas. If you look at the upper right, that's an estimate of how much of the GDP will be generated in water scarce or water stressed areas. By 2050, it's estimated to be about 45%. So not a great projection. Unfortunately, if you look at this slide, this is pretty much where we are. We essentially arrived early in the projection of water scarcity. And if you live in the western U.S., you know that this is real, and it's impacting businesses and the public sector and so on. So when we talk to clients, I ask them to think about where are they operating right now, where is their agricultural supply chain, where are their customers right now, and what's their projection going forward? Are they going to grow in emerging markets? Are they going to double their growth by driving into emerging markets? If that's the case, then that's pretty much where all the red is in this map. So that's what needs to happen. Think about water scarcity now and project it out. So what are the drivers? I really want to make a very big distinction between scarcity and climate change. Climate change certainly can drive scarcity, there's no doubt, but there are other big drivers that are arguably more important. So, we've had periods of drought, but things have really changed, and what's happened essentially that there's this increase in demand. So that is being driven by primarily an increase in population growth, the rise of the middle class, projections of more food, more energy. The use of water in the thermoelectric power industry is very, very significant, so it takes a lot of water to cool coal-fired plants or nukes, and the world needs more energy and more food and more water. So that will continue to drive scarcity. If you layer in things like climate change or short-term drought, it makes the issue even more complex going forward. Other complexities in terms of public policy, water rights regulations that have been in place for 150 years, all of that's coming under question right now. So how do we deal with scarcity, and how do we change some of the regulatory requirements that allocate water? And then depleted assets. We're essentially mining groundwater, which means that we're extracting water faster than it can be recharged. So we're taking it out of the bank. That offers no buffer for any of the shocks that we're seeing by drought or climate change. So these are the big players in all of this. If you talk to some of the big food and beverage companies that are leading in the space, they talk about water scarcity. They really don't talk about the drought, and that's important. The economic impact of water scarcity, not to pick on the state of California, but there's an estimate that this is probably a $3 billion hit to the state economy right now. That's not good news. It's the world's 7th largest economy, roughly. $3 billion starts to become meaningful in the scheme of things. But this is not unique to California. California is essentially the canary in the mine, really highlighting some of the big issues that countries are facing and regions are facing. So we're seeing that in China, we're seeing it in Brazil, having an economic impact and really hindering the ability to grow. What have we learned? Hope is not a strategy, so let's stop calling it the drought. Let's deal with some of the structural issues that we're facing in terms of how we manage water, price water, essentially don't value water from both an economic and human perspective. So the past is not a guide to the future. Things really have changed, and we need to be thinking about what the world will look like going forward. Scarcity does impact economic growth. Again, unfortunately, there are too many examples of that. We learned about virtual water. So if you look at the water footprint of food products, beverage products, but basically anything that we use, including computer chips, it has a water footprint. If you take that chip or that food product and move it, you're essentially importing or exporting embedded water. That is virtual water. That is becoming important in the dialogue around the agricultural sector right now. How much water does it take to grow something, and where does it go? Is that smart economic policy or not? It's a choice in the scheme of things. Physical risks, regulatory risks, and reputational risks. I'll get into this a little bit later in more detail. But what is happening is that physical scarcity is ever so slowly driving changes in public policy and highlighting regulatory risks to companies, and also exposing reputational risks. And that's important for consumer-facing companies. Public policy will align with the new normal. I prefer to call this the new normal. It sharpens the mind. We start making more strategic decisions about water. Scarcity does drive innovation, so there is a happy story to all of this in that if you have to do with less or without, you get pretty creative. You get creative in terms of partnerships, and you get very creative in terms of technology solutions. So water scarcity is business risk. These are the key questions in my mind. This is what I believe companies should be asking themselves, hopefully. Look at the bottom. If you look at every multinational, they're projecting very significant growth. If that growth is in emerging markets where water is scarce or you're operating under stress conditions, you need to think about how your water strategy, your water stewardship strategy, essentially fuels your business growth. How do your consumers access water, safe water to drink, and how do you help them do that. So a number of different dynamics going on in terms of business growth and the availability of water to fuel that growth. In the world of water risk, this is how we break this out. We talk about physical risk, which is, do I have enough water when I need it, where I need it, of the right quality? There's a regulatory risk. What are the regulations right now? How might they change? That includes water pricing, allocation issues, water law, and so on. And the reputational risk. How do others view how I manage or don't manage water? And the important part here is this is across the entire value chain. So you could be doing really great things in your own operations within the four walls of your manufacturing plant, but if you're not addressing your supply chain and you're not addressing how consumers use your product or access your product, you're, for the most part, really missing the big part of your water risk. You can roll this all up and quantify business value at risk and start making better decisions about your strategy and somewhat independent of pricing of water. Reputational risk is really the wild card in all of this. This is really a challenge. Anyone with a Twitter account is essentially a stakeholder now and can voice their opinion as to how they're viewing how you're managing water, so really a very important issue. Water scarcity is a current business risk. This is not something that's projected out. I can show you maps at 2025, 2030, 2050. The reality is that businesses are being impacted right now, and they're making investments on how to mitigate that risk and how to fuel that business growth. Two reports worth reading. One is the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report that comes out every January. Unfortunately, water risk was categorized as number one this past year. And the CDP water report that's been on for the past several years both provide really good insight as to how businesses are viewing water-related risks and identifying business opportunities. If you look at the CDP report, the icons at the bottom here, it's not the diamond industry that's impacted, it is extractives. So mining companies identified water risk as one of the most important risks that they face. The energy sector also, so oil and gas in particular, and then consumer staples. And the number one risk was financial for them. I'm going to go through these quickly now. A couple of things about this report. If you look at agricultural food production and water risk, the upper right, it's not a happy story. So we're basically producing food in areas that have very significant water stress and water scarcity issues. I'm not going to talk about water quality very much, but about 80% of the water discharged globally is untreated, and we are polluting our surface waters at a pretty good clip. So you combine that water with water scarcity issues, and we're really squeezing our availability of water. The CDP water report, if you look at consumer staples here, that sector identified water risk as a very high risk for them as a business. Again, I encourage you to read the report. 61% of the companies said that they were impacted during the reporting period. So for companies that voluntarily acknowledge that they've been impacted, that's significant. So what do we do about this? Elements of a water strategy. This is a very simple way to break this down and think about, well, how do I address all of these risks? It really gets into things like conservation, preservation, protecting what you have, investing in efficiency, water reuse, wetlands conservation, thinking about what you can do at the watershed level. Engagement with stakeholders is absolutely critical in all of this. You cannot solve the water issue alone. And then innovation, again, technology innovation. Fueling growth, I touched on this a little bit. This is our maturity model. This is how we look at clients or prospective clients and where do they fit. So to the left, there's essentially no strategy. It's what me worry. I turn on the tap, I have the water, life is good. There's an efficiency strategy, which is basically, I'm just going to be more efficient in terms of how I use water in my manufacturing. That's great, but that is a very small part of the whole risk story here. So you really need to think more broadly. A little bit to the right, it's social license to operate, so a defensive risk view of the world. What do I do to ensure that I have social license to operate? And then for the right, these are where the leaders sit. And what they do is they best integrate their water stewardship strategy with their business growth strategy. So how do they ensure they have enough water to drive that business growth in key markets? And two things that they do. They value water, independent of price, and they also engage in something called collective action, working with stakeholders to come up with solutions to the wicked problem of water. So water is an opportunity. Ecosystems. So how do we basically work together to collaborate on finding solutions to water scarcity and water quality issues? Ecosystems is a term of art. It's basically where a group of organizations, private sector, public sector, NGOs, come together to tackle a complex problem. And water is a great example of an ecosystem that has formed and evolving to tackle this issue. Of course, this is the water ecosystem with little drops. But it gives you a feel for the categories of actors that are really coming together in diverse ways to solve scarcity and quality issues. And there's some terrific examples out there of competitors working in a pre-competitive space and driving investments in technology and also trying to influence public policy so we get to a better place in terms of how we value water to drive economic and business growth and promote well-being from a social perspective. An example is the CEO Water Mandate, the Water Action Hub. This is an online platform for stakeholders to come together and collaborate on water-related issues. It's sort of like Match.com for water. It's been very effective. It's, I think, 9 water basins globally. And then no presentation would be complete without a discussion of the Internet of Things and big data, but if you really want to look at very exciting opportunities in the ag space and technology, really great examples of drones, big data, machine-to-machine communications, and so on. Quick comment about data. We all want more data, but we're paralyzed by that need. What we need is better information on a real-time basis and better decision-making. I would argue that we're not doing a very good job in terms of using the data that we have. And we need to start looking at data differently to make better informed decisions on business strategy and public policy decisions. This is just an example of a dashboard to look at the economic value of water to the state of Florida, in particular the ag sector. You can start to get a better sense, well, what does water mean to the state economy? And how do I identify areas where I want better data? And how do I start making choices? You can do the same thing on the business side of the equation. What's the value of water to my agricultural supply chain? And how do I start making better investments to not drive efficiency alone, but to ensure that I have a supply chain going forward? So with that, thank you. I don't have books here to sign, but if you're interested in a book, please let me know.
And now it's my pleasure to introduce Thomas Harter, the Cooperative Extension Specialist at the Department of Land, Air, and Water Resources at the University of California, Davis. In addition to all the other titles that I read earlier, Thomas's research group has done extensive modeling, laboratory, and field work to evaluate the impacts of agriculture and human activity on groundwater flow and contaminant transport in complex aquifer and soil systems. And I'm going to fast forward, since you walked on stage already, to just say that beginning in 2008, Thomas's research in the extension program began to focus on farm advisory, dairy industry, and dairy farmers to better understand the effects of dairy operations and water quality. Thomas?
Thank you, Arlin. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity. So I'm a groundwater hydrologist, and I thought I'll sort of drill down on the issues that we just heard about from Will, specifically with respect to this link between what you're doing and groundwater, agriculture, and really the long-term 100, 200-year food security, although I think some of the risks are really much more short-term. We'll already head up this map. I just flew in from California yesterday. I came out of the Sierra Nevada on Wednesday from a brief vacation, and the drought, fortunately, has become, if nothing else, it's become a real conversation generator. Nothing like a good crisis to work on something, and this is really where we are. I would disagree with Will when he showed the half-dead tree. This is not a superbug story. I disagree with his statement that this is not a superbug story. This is a superbug story, except for it's not about the superbugs, it's about water. But that slide that Lance showed this morning, where we get to these superbugs, like a drought. So my superbug is a drought. We get these spikes in conversations, and then we go on business as usual. But what's really happening in the background is that we get these spikes, our attention grows, and then when we don't watch for it, it actually keeps getting worse. So on the water side, just as on the superbug side, we're actually seeing an increasing threat globally. So these pictures, you've seen many of those. Nature's taken a big hit. The snowpack in the Sierra Nevada is significantly lower. It was amazing to see that yesterday from the airplane. This photo is less than 24 hours. The reservoirs in California are empty. We see lots of bathtub rims. We have seen about, I think it amounts to less than 5% fallowing in California agriculture. It might be a little bit more this year with even higher water pressures in a fourth year of drought. We've seen an amazing number of dry wells. Reportedly, over 3,000 wells went dry, with many actually going unreported. Many people bringing in bottled water, especially in the agricultural communities where people primarily rely on their domestic wells. And then if any of you have been to California and driven from LA to San Francisco, you probably haven't missed this sign. Food grows where water flows. That's the connection between you and me as a groundwater hydrologist. But just how big of a connection is this? When we look at where does water go in this country, more than half of the water ends up in agricultural products, basically in our food and fiber supply. The other big portion is, and that's another link that you and I have, is in the energy sector. Most of the water use in the energy sector is for cooling. And most of that yellow part of that circle actually stays in the river. It doesn't go away. Most of the blue part in that water use is evapotranspiration by the plants and actually disappears into the atmosphere. It's no longer usable in any form as drinking water or irrigation water. And the United States is actually on the better end of this stick. Partly because we have so much of our, in terms of fraction, so much of our water use is in the energy sector. Other countries, and the agricultural sector has an even bigger imprint on the overall water usage. That is not surprising. If we look at where we grow our foods, it's in the warmer climates around the globe. And it's in those climates where we need to supply rain, to supplement rain with irrigation water. That's the distinction between what we call green water and blue water. Rain is our green water, where we grow our agricultural products purely based on rain. That is the green water use of our crops. But where we have to supply irrigation water, whether it's from rivers or lakes or from groundwater, that's our blue water use. And that blue water use is very large in those regions where we grow most of our food. In fact, I have heard a lot in the last year and a half the argument that in California, we shouldn't really grow food. It's too hot, it's too dry. To make that argument is to say that we get rid of 40% of our food production, because 40% of our agricultural products are grown in climates and in places like California. And like in California, we rely to a large degree on groundwater as part of that equation. We have all seen the empty bathtubs, the bathtub rims around our mostly empty reservoirs. On that drought map that you saw earlier, 2 months ago, Texas was a big red blob. That red blob has gone away in less than 2 weeks because they had big floods filling their reservoirs and filling their soil moisture. But it hasn't refilled their groundwater. If we get indeed a very wet El Nino season next winter in California, that red blob may disappear from the map, but what's not going to disappear from the map, even after all the surface water reservoirs may be filled next spring, is that we have a big empty reservoir below the ground surface. And we do that not just in California, but we do that in India, we do that in China, we do that in the Mediterranean regions, we do that in the Middle East. And that speaks to the graph that Lance showed, with that ever-increasing risk that we're running out of water. Why do people use so much groundwater? Well, it's a very large reservoir. If nothing else, it's the perfect drought insurance, and nature has endowed us with a full reservoir on that end. But people also use it because it's easily accessible. Farmers in India and China, they just need to drill a hole. They just need to have a well. They don't need to come up with an irrigation district or build large water projects. In these less strong economies, building large water projects until recently hasn't really been an option. There are government subsidies that have helped that, particularly in South Asia. You can grow higher value crops because you have less water risk, at least in the short run, while that groundwater supply lasts, and you're less at risk for failing during drought. And as a result, in the last 30 years, we've seen a tremendous increase in the use of that subsurface reservoir. And we have become incredibly dependent on that subsurface reservoir for supplying the water that grows our foods. And the big users here are India, China, Pakistan, Iran, and North America. As a result of that groundwater use, we've seen massive declines in water levels in some of our largest aquifer systems. The High Plains, this is a graph showing the decline in water levels, which is somewhat less up north, Nebraska, Kansas, and it's quite large down in the southern part of the High Plains in the Texas Panhandle. And it's essentially a downward spiral, with the Texas Panhandle being on a few, basically having left about a few decades, if that much, in supplies. The Central Valley has made big news. The southern part of the Central Valley in particular is on a downward spiral and has been on a downward spiral for several decades. Northeast India, based on satellite photos, but also based on ground measurements, has a gigantic gap in their groundwater storage. That's one, and that decline in water resources has had hidden costs in terms of drilling new wells. In California now, a lot of homeowners sitting on lots that are worth $50,000 to $80,000 are spending that much money just to drill a new well. We have increased pumping costs as we're lifting water an extra 100 or 200 or even 300 feet. And we're spending a lot of money on new wells and on treatment. We have land subsidence. Last year, large swaths of the southern part of the Central Valley have seen land subsidence on the order of 6 inches across large parts of the southern part of the Central Valley. This map, everything in red and green is showing subsidence rates, land subsidence rates exceeding 6 inches. We've seen seawater intrusion. You've seen on the global map that a lot of these areas where we're growing food are along the coasts. Along these coasts where we're using groundwater resources, we have seawater intrusion. And with the groundwater levels going down, we're losing a lot of our rivers. When I gave the presentation at CIA in California last fall, I made a little example with a granola bowl. You all, to the degree you're involved in food preparation, you take any food that doesn't have a strong skin, insulating skin, and you leave it sitting, after a little while you're going to see a water puddle somewhere at the lowest point of what's sitting in front of you, right? Well, our rivers are the lowest point in the landscape, and that's where our groundwater usually oozes out. To the degree we're drawing down that reservoir, we're losing that support for our rivers. In the long run, we're losing the supply altogether. And where we're doing that the most are some of the countries that have the most population. So the risk is not just one that's limited to the North China Plain or to Northwest India or to Western United States, but it's really a risk to a large part of our populations. And if any one of these big groundwater pumping centers is going to fail because it doesn't have that groundwater anymore, it'll create a global food crisis. Now, there are some examples, small-scale examples, of how that can be averted. The Santa Clara Valley, Silicon Valley, has been very successful, and so has Southern California, in recovering from low groundwater levels that they had in the middle of the 20th century. They have done so by increasing their local water supplies, capturing more of their rainfall before it runs into the ocean, by decreasing the demand. We're not using any more water today in California in our cities than we did 30 years ago when it was 2/3 of the population. by doing lots of recharge projects in wet years, saving that wet year water for the dry years, and by recycling water, as here shown in Orange County. But there's not only the water quantity aspect, there's the water quality aspect as well. This is a map of the amount of nitrate pollution in our aquifers across the country. Everything that's red on here exceeds the drinking water limit, the safe drinking water limit for nitrate, which is a product of fertilizers and manure. And you can see that most of the regions that have excess amounts of nitrate in their groundwater are our agricultural regions. It's part of it's one of the impacts that agriculture and food production has on water resources. As a result, a lot of rural communities need to supply themselves with bottled water because their wells don't produce safe drinking water. And there's an extension to the superbug story that you heard earlier. We just had a paper accepted 2 days ago where we were reporting that we sampled 200 domestic wells in the Central Valley, both near and away from dairies. Of those 200 wells, we found E. coli in about 35 of those wells. And of those 35 positive E. coli, 33 were also positive for antibiotic resistance. That's an astounding occurrence of antibiotic resistant genes in our drinking water. And that's a story that surely is going to be, that's just sort of the tip of the iceberg. On the surface water side, you all have perhaps heard of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, which is actually because of the nitrates, to a large part, not only, but to a large part, because of the nitrates that are in the groundwater of the Mississippi River watershed, which slowly oozes out into the streams that all feed into the Mississippi River, and then as a result, cause this dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So where's the link with the food service industry, and what can you do about this? Many of the points that Will made, many of the points that Lance made, I want to reiterate. The biggest water footprint comes out of animal agriculture. That's where we use most of the water, and that's where we also have most of the water pollution problems. Jason Wright did this beautiful graphic, and he did beautiful graphics throughout the report that you've seen. I wanted to do a shout out to him here on the water footprint by serving size, which I think is a really clever way to show the water footprint, both the green water footprint and the blue water footprint. This is for a US average. In California alone, if you look at beef grown on grassland out in the hills, that's just a green water footprint because that's just rain-fed grass. If I look at dairy in California, that's all based on forage that has been irrigated. That's all blue water use. So take this with a grain of salt and know that the water footprint locally may be very different from what it is here in terms of how it divides between green water use and blue water use. The other thing to know is that not all blue water use is bad water use. Unlike with CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, where a greenhouse gas emission is a greenhouse gas emission and will do its contribution to global warming. Using blue water to the degree that we use blue water that we can then regenerate is not a bad thing. So one of the things to look at when we look at water usage is it sustainable? Are you operating and using water in an environment where you can regenerate that irrigation water that you're using? And that certainly has come up in the conversation on almonds that went viral earlier this spring, where everybody talked about the gallon of water that's being used with one almond. So are we to get away with all of the California foods because we're in the middle of a big drought? California actually has in the works, we're not there yet, but in the works, a number of very interesting policies that are very unique to California. We have a Clean Water Act that actually includes groundwater as a water body, and that regulates not only discharges into jurisdictional surface waters, for any of you that have heard the Clean Water Act discussion this spring, but also includes discharges into groundwater. California is way ahead on the curve in terms of regulating agriculture with respect to its discharges to groundwater. It's a complex area. It's an area that we're new to. It's an area that is evolving. A big part of it is collecting data and being transparent. California has gone also from being last on managing groundwater to a very progressive Groundwater Management Act passed last year, and we're in the middle of writing the regulations this summer that will regulate water usage. And the long-term vision will be that California agriculture will be forced by these regulations to be operating in a sustainable way, both with respect to surface water and with respect to groundwater. So the takeaway messages here are the same that Will already mentioned, and to a large degree the same that Lance mentioned with respect to the superbugs. Know your supplier. Know the water sustainability, both on the quantity and the quality side of your supplier. Quantity is about green water and blue water and the sustainability of the blue water, the irrigation water. Quality is what in the water footprint world we call gray water, for better or worse. Know what the impact is of your supplier on not just surface water quality, but also groundwater quality. Ask for transparency. Ask that monitoring be done. We do way too little monitoring, even though we have lots of high tech. We have to figure out how to do that, and Will spoke to the data flood we already have in managing that data flood. So those are some of the key takeaway points. And my last takeaway point is, when you supply tea, don't ever supply your hot water in a container that ever had coffee in it, because you all know how, the tea drinkers among you know how bad the tea tastes when you do that. It takes very little to contaminate tea hot water with coffee taste. That's no different in groundwater. A little bit of contamination is going to go a long way to make that water fairly disgusting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. We have a few minutes for questions, and I was thinking, Will, about you talking about water and innovation. In the restaurant community, there's been a lot of innovations going on. Some restaurants are now only serving you a glass of water upon request. Some are making an expensive investment in more efficient dishwashers. In fine dining, the innovation is these, some are bringing forward little marble or stone slabs where you rest your silverware in between courses, rather than taking it away and washing several sets of forks and knives and spoons. A lot of effort's going there. How big a difference does that make?
Not a whole lot. I mean, it goes back to the issue, what is your water footprint across your entire value chain, and address the high-risk portions of that value chain. And in the food and beverage sector, that is absolutely in the ag part of the value chain. And if you're a personal care company, it's there, and also how consumers use your products. And I think all the little things that you can do within the fence are important, but not going to move the needle.
And Thomas, I know in California, some cities are now even giving restaurants rebates on dishwashers. Is this going to be a significant contribution?
To me, it goes into the category of, it's a tragedy of the commons, right? It's just like with greenhouse gases. This isn't going to make a difference. Whether or not I drink this is not going to make a difference in the big picture. It's a lot of the little actions that make some of the difference. And I think that goes for the dishwashers more so than for whether or not I'm serving water to my customers. I think the even bigger piece in that water footprint is on the energy side. I'm a big fan of having warmer restaurants in the summer and cooler restaurants in the winter, rather than having an ice-cold restaurant in the summer and a really hot restaurant in the winter. There's a lot of water footprint right there. And that's where, as a retail owner, I can have the most immediate impact and have the most control. The larger impact is going to be on the food side and the food production side.
So you ran down a great list for what every food service operator should be asking of their suppliers, and perhaps even asking their distributors, those companies that sit in the middle, to tell them about where their food comes from, how it was grown, the blue, the gray, and the green water footprint and all of that, and also know what part of the world it's coming from for risk. When you've seen these programs, Will, implemented in supply chains, How do they get started? Leading company, industry consortium, everyone asking?
Yeah, it varies. I think it comes down to leadership, though. I think it's, is there a recognition at the C-suite that water is a risk issue and a business opportunity? If yes, what's the value of water to my business? How do I be a catalyst for change, and how do I work with others, including competitors in a pre-competitive space through industry associations or organizations like the 2030 Water Resources Group or CEO Water Mandate? But it always comes down to, I think, leadership and a recognition that something has to change.
So I want to ask you each to take a moment and say, what should those changes be? You've already talked about supply chain transparency. So when the chefs, the food service operators, the supply chain sustainability and marketing executives in this audience go home and back to their office on Monday, what are the next 2 or 3 things they can do?
Ask the supplier about what is your water footprint, how sustainable are the water resources where you're growing your food, what is the water quality impact, and after they answer the first round, do a second round and ask, so did you measure this actually on your farm? Do you do groundwater monitoring on your farm? Do you do water quality monitoring in your surface water discharge off of your farm on a regular basis? How do you know that your groundwater supply is sustainable in the long run?
And Will, if you were to help some of those in the audience make the case to a C-suite executive that we should be acting now, or we should be waiting for regulation, or we should be waiting for rain, what's the message you should give to the rest of your colleagues or those you report to about how to start taking action on this issue?
Start to think about what your business would look like without water across your entire value chain, and quantify what that risk looks like, and then make investments accordingly. Don't wait for regulations. I think California is a great example of regulations, and I think California is doing a lot of great things, but quite honestly, public policy is catching up with the reality of scarcity and quality issues, and as a business, you can't afford to do that. And again, reputational risk, that's an on-off switch. Someone will shut you down.
And to add to that, I seeing how it works in California, the strength comes really from the food service industry. It comes from the consumer. The strength is not going to come from the regulatory agencies. In the longer, bigger picture across the US and in the global picture, the strength will only come from the consumer in actually making these changes and looking at those long-term risks.
As we think about finite resources, the clock has hit 0. I wish we had more time to talk. But please join me in thanking Thomas and Will.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it. Thank you, Arlin.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We're not done yet. And I don't know what the walk-up music is going to be for the next person, but it should be something special because she has done so much to make this event possible. And it brings me great pleasure to introduce Sophie Egan, Director of Programs and Culinary Nutrition for Strategic Initiatives at the Culinary Institute of America. Sophie?
No walk-up music for me. Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here to introduce the next session. First, I just wanted to say, we've covered a lot of material here in the past few days. And on Wednesday, we heard from Will Rosenzweig, the founder and dean of the CIA's new Food Business School. And he spoke of the seed of his idea for this new school and the unprecedented enthusiasm he was seeing among his graduate students at UC Berkeley to find creative ways to improve the food system. Well, I was one of those students, and it's why I'm here today working on Menus of Change, and I could not be more honored to be helping to lead this initiative. I also am very honored to introduce a very important session today, and it's on food, obesity, and the incubating diabetes epidemic. What's at risk and what to do? To guide us through this topic is one of our country's leading minds on the subject, David Ludwig is a practicing pediatrician and researcher at Boston Children's Hospital, where he is the founding director of the Optimal Weight for Life program. Dr. Ludwig is also professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and professor of nutrition at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. His research focuses on the effects of diet on hormones, metabolism, and body weight, and he is the author of a book on childhood obesity for parents entitled Ending the Food Fight: Guide Your Child to a Healthy Weight in a Fast Food, Fake Food World. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Ludwig.
Thank you, Sophie, and a great pleasure to be here today. And I'd like to start with a 10-second physics lesson, which is that the first law of thermodynamics says that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Okay, so now we're done with physics. But the reason I bring this up is because that law has served as the foundation for essentially every approach to the prevention and treatment of obesity for the last century. Because that's the equation, that's the law that gives rise to the equation we've heard so much: calorie intake minus calorie expenditure equals calories stored. And because in humans, calories are almost entirely stored as fat, that equation can best be said as reflecting change in body fatness or adiposity. According to the conventional view, obesity is an individual failure in the control of this energy balance. So in an environment with ubiquitous tasty foods, we tend to easily take in too many calories, and we have few opportunities to burn off those excess calories given our sedentary lifestyle. And so the calories build up in the bloodstream in terms of calorie-rich substances like glucose and lipids, and then are forced into fat cells, leading to weight gain, increase in fatness, and then the associated risk factors. So from this perspective, the solution is very simple. Just eat less and move more. In fact, this has been emphasized in virtually every conventional approach. The USDA, on its website, MyPlate website, states that reaching a healthy weight is a balancing act. The secret is learning how to balance your energy in and energy out. The ultimate expression of this perspective is the first food guide pyramid of 1992, in which, among all the nutrients, fat was placed at the top because it has twice the calories per gram, or per bite in effect, of carbohydrate. And instead, carbohydrates were at the bottom, you remember? All of these starchy foods, we were supposed to really load up on those, 6 to 11 servings per day. Things haven't worked out so well. This slide shows the relationship between fat intake and obesity prevalence. It doesn't prove that there's a causal relationship between the two, but it suggests that continuing focus on reducing dietary fat, we were at 42% in the 60s, we're down to near that magic 30% of fat now, that a continuing focus on reducing dietary fat is unlikely to cause the obesity prevalence to suddenly, magically decline. And in the, I guess we can term the mother of all low-fat diet studies, the Women's Health Initiative, 50,000 women were placed onto either a low-fat diet or a control diet and followed for a number of years. A study, I should add, that was really poorly designed to look at dietary fat because it was strongly biased to favor the low-fat diet. The people in that group got extensive support. They, I think, had 18 individual and group counseling sessions and were encouraged to eat lots of fruits and vegetables, whereas the control group just got written educational materials. The intervention group did show a substantial and sustained decline in dietary fat, this most calorie-dense nutrient, the one that we were supposed to be restricting from this energy balance perspective. And despite this decline in dietary fat, body weight decreased by a mere 2 kilograms, little less than 5 pounds, maximum. at 1 year, with virtually no difference thereafter. And this may simply be the fact that this group got a lot more attention and nothing to do with dietary fat. In fact, the meta-analyses, so the systematic reviews that are now looking at studies that are fairly done, in which the low-fat group and the higher-fat group get treated equally, show the opposite, that low-fat diets tend to do less well than a variety of other alternatives, such as the Mediterranean diet or even low-carbohydrate, very high-fat diets, which we'll talk about a little bit more, raising the possibility that our calorie-balanced approach to obesity, focused on the most calorie-dense nutrient, fat, has not only been ineffective, but might have actually contributed to the obesity epidemic. We know that very few people can successfully maintain weight loss over the long term. In this study, nationally representative, only 1 in 6 overweight or obese adults report ever having maintained at least 10% weight loss for at least 1 year. And that's only a small proportion of the actual excess body weight that most people carry. And 1 year is, of course, a very short time frame within an adult life. In pediatrics, the situation is, if anything, more bleak. A quote here from Len Epstein, who is well known in the field: most interventions are marked by small changes in weight or adiposity and substantial relapse. And this is a very big problem, because unless we do something about the obesity epidemic, the impact on society will continue to mount for years to come. And to see that, let's envision the epidemic as unfolding in 4 phases. The first phase, this rapid increase in prevalence that you've heard so much about in this conference, occurred through the 70s, 80s, and 90s most dramatically, and may be plateauing. But obesity rates can't keep it going up year after year indefinitely. I mean, we reach at some point, a biological limit. But without actual substantial declines in prevalence, that will translate into increasing impact, because it can take years for prevalence to translate into the second phase, which is obesity-related complications like type 2 diabetes, fatty liver, and the like. And it can take an additional period of time for phase 3 to evolve, life-threatening complications. Someone developing a heart attack, a stroke, or renal failure from diabetes. It's one thing for an adult who's been gaining weight excessively through their 20s, 30s, and 40s to develop type 2 diabetes in their 50s, a heart attack or a stroke in their 60s. It's a very different thing if that clock starts ticking at age 10. And then in the last phase, one can postulate this feed-forward transgenerational process in which an obese woman, when she's pregnant, exposes that developing fetus to an abnormal environment, leading to permanent changes in how that developing fetus regulates its hormones, its metabolic pathways, increasing risk for the next generation even beyond the risk that presently exists. It's a frightening prospect. And in terms of economic impact, according to estimates, and these are, the first estimate is in 2005 dollars, that obesity, the direct costs of obesity, not the total costs, the direct costs are approaching $200 billion annually, or about 16.5% of total spending on medical care. By 2020, half the U.S. adult population is predicted to have diabetes or prediabetes, with annual costs approaching $500 billion. And by 2030, cardiovascular disease is anticipated to cost $1 trillion, and most of that is related to obesity or poor diet. These are obviously staggering totals. If we had this money available in productive, useful opportunities for investment, on the one hand, Democrats could have social spending, the Republicans could have balanced budgets, and maybe we could all get along. But with the shrinking financial pie caused by obesity-related disease, sucking so much money out of discretionary spending, political paralysis is likely to only increase as everybody is fighting for that shrinking piece of pie. And this could mean the difference between stability or bankruptcy of Medicare, expanding or contracting health insurance coverage, improving versus declining worker productivity, the indirect costs of obesity, absenteeism, presenteeism, and the like, and increasing versus decreasing national budget deficits. Really, the competitiveness of the U.S. society on an international basis. So, I've argued that the conventional approach to obesity based on the first law of thermodynamics, calorie balance, has failed miserably. And that unless we do something about it, we're in serious difficulties as a society. So we have to ask, why hasn't this approach, so simple, just eat less and move more, why hasn't it worked? Well, one key problem is that it disregards a basic biological fact known by obesity researchers for well over a half century, which is that body weight is regulated. It's controlled by a complex feedback system of interconnected hormones, metabolic pathways, and nervous system signals that connect organs throughout the body. So, for example, when an individual, and the same is true for an experimental animal, in the laboratory, or a human, when a human, whatever their body weight is, high or low, whatever their baseline body weight is, when they're food restricted so that they lose weight, what happens? Well, we know that they get hungrier, and also their metabolic rate declines. That's going to create the internal environment that will almost inevitably lead to weight regain back to baseline. But the opposite is also true. When you overfeed an individual in a scientific study or an experimental animal and body weight increases, their hunger goes way down, and energy expenditure, the number of calories they're burning off, just their metabolic rate, goes up. Individuals in overfeeding studies are just as miserable as those in underfeeding studies. And the moment that force feeding protocol ends, they very happily stop eating for a while, or eating much, much less until their weight returns to this baseline, giving rise to this notion of a body weight set point. But if we do have a body weight set point, a weight that's regulated based on our individual factors, genetics and other things, causing somebody to be heavy or light, but stably so, relatively, we have to address two questions. One is, why is this defended body weight, why is this body weight set point, why does it seem to be creeping up year after year after year among genetically stable populations? What has caused us to go from maintaining a very stable BMI as a society through the 40s, 50s, 60s, early 70s, to suddenly having that go up without experimentation being done on our genes, we hope. And what can we do about it, most importantly? So we know that the first law of thermodynamics can't be wrong per se, but perhaps our assumptions about the direction of causality are incorrect. Instead of the arrows pointing from left to right, what if they actually point in the other direction? In other words, what if fat cells have been triggered to suck in too many calories? And as a result, instead of there being too many calories circulating in the blood, there are in fact too few calories in the blood because the fat cells are just taking in more than their fair share. They're acting greedy. If that happens, what would result? Well, hunger, because the brain, seeing that there aren't enough calories in the blood, will cause us to get hungry and eat to replace that deficit. And at the same time, energy expenditure will decline because the body, the brain, thinks that it can't necessarily see this extra fat. It just sees that there aren't enough calories for the rest of the body. So it thinks that it's actually starving, raising the possibility that obesity, we think of it as a state of excess, but it may in reality be a state of deprivation because of a problem at the fat cells. If that happens, if this is true, then the conventional approach to eat less and move more can now be seen as, at best, symptomatic treatment. And it actually may make the situation worse, because if there aren't enough calories in the blood, cutting back on what you eat and trying to move more is going to create a bigger problem here in the middle. And that explains what most dieters experience. Rapidly rising hunger, which ultimately becomes irresistible, and dropping energy levels. So what has triggered our fat cells to act in this disruptive way to our metabolism? Well, one possibility is that it's insulin, too much insulin. Insulin is the granddaddy of all anabolic hormones. Anabolic meaning promoting growth and storage of calories. Insulin is, in effect, the ultimate fat cell fertilizer. How do we know this? Well, in type 1 diabetes, which is a problem of not having enough insulin, beta cells can't produce insulin, so people with type 1 diabetes have an absolute inability to make sufficient insulin levels. They inevitably lose weight, no matter how much they eat. They can be eating 5,000, 7,000 calories a day, they'll still lose weight without insulin. But conversely, too much insulin, either in someone with type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes being overtreated, or drugs that cause insulin secretion, again, inevitably cause weight gain. So maybe something has caused insulin levels to go up. That's triggering our fat cells to go into this feeding frenzy, leading to the body actually being in a state of deprivation. And what would be causing our insulin levels to increase? Well, that's really just endocrinology 101. Dietary carbohydrate in general, but a specific kind of carbohydrate, the highly processed carbohydrates, because we're going to talk about why all carbohydrates aren't alike. In fact, total carbohydrate affects insulin secretion, but so does the kind reflected by something called the glycemic index. And that's just a measure of how different carbohydrates affect blood sugar. So after we eat, not just sugar, concentrated sugar, but starchy foods, especially refined starchy foods, white bread, white rice, pasta, a little less pasta, potato products, cookies, chips, crackers, all of those low-fat foods that flooded our diet in the 70s and 80s. After we eat those, blood sugar, they digest in seconds, literally, and blood sugar goes way up, insulin goes way up, and then comes down rapidly. The same amount of carbohydrate consumed as whole fruit, legumes, and to a considerable degree, minimally processed grains has a much more gentle impact on blood sugar and insulin. So here's a study we did that looked at, here's basically, don't worry about the fine print, just basically instant oatmeal. That's a whole grain, but it's highly processed, so it's going to digest very quickly. Compared to steel-cut oats, that's minimally processed, old-fashioned oatmeal. That's how grandma probably made oats, or great-grandma at least, compared to a vegetable omelet with fruit. And so we gave these 3 meals to 12 obese adolescents on different days, and we found that, as expected, after the instant oatmeal, blood sugar surged compared to the steel-cut oats or the vegetable omelet. But what goes up must come down, and then blood sugar dropped to this relatively low range, 3, 4, 5 hours after the instant oatmeal. Same calories, different blood sugar. Now look at this. This is epinephrine, or adrenaline, our emergency stress hormone. We think of that being secreted at times of fight or flight if we're being, if our life is endangered. But from an evolutionary perspective, low blood sugar is a much greater risk than is a saber-toothed tiger chasing us. If blood sugar drops, the body is at risk, the brain especially. The brain can't go for more than, cannot go for even a few seconds without steady access to calories. We'd pass out, coma, seizure, and death would ensue. So we have all these systems designed to keep our blood sugar and our calories regulated. And look what happened. It surged to very high levels after the instant oatmeal compared to the steel-cut oats or the vegetable almonds. Same calories, different hormonal states. And how would you feel if your blood sugar was crashing enough to cause the stress hormone secretion? Well, if you were a 10-year-old kid, you might look like you have ADD. You know, and isn't it interesting that ADD, attention deficit disorder, seems to be skyrocketing with the invasion of children's diets with all these sugary, starchy, processed carbohydrates. But coming back to obesity, you get hungry, because hunger and food intake is the quickest way to restore blood sugar, and that's what we saw, that after the instant oatmeal, the children, the adolescents, consumed 600 or 700 calories more than they did after the steel-cut oats or the vegetable almond. If a fraction of this difference were maintained meal after meal, day after day, that actually could explain the whole obesity epidemic. Now, clearly there are other factors at play, but it demonstrates that this could be an important driver. And what's happening in the brain at this time? So here's another study in which we looked at 12 overweight and obese young men. It was done in a double-blind crossover fashion. That's not oftentimes done in nutrition research. We could do that here because we could prepare milkshakes that had the same look, the same sweetness that was controlled, but one had slow digesting carbohydrate and the other had fast digesting carbohydrate. Same protein, same fat. And then we gave the subjects these milkshakes and then did brain imaging with something called functional magnetic resonance imaging. And as expected, blood sugar rose higher after the fast-acting milkshake than the slow-acting milkshake. At 4 hours, notice that's the time point that we were most interested in. There's an indication of lower blood sugar, and the individuals reported greater hunger. What happened at the brain at that time? We saw one area, just one area that lit up really like a laser, in that every single subject responded the same way. I've never seen that in a research study, even with 12 subjects, which isn't a huge number. Everyone, I think 11 or 12, everybody responded the same way, giving us strong statistical power to say that this was a real finding. What is this area? Well, if you're like me, I'm not a neuroscientist, I had no idea. So we checked, and it turned out to be the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens is considered ground zero for the classic addictions, like cocaine, alcoholism, heroin and the like, gambling, lights up this area. It's rich in dopamine, this pleasure chemical. Now, raises the possibility of food addiction. A controversial concept. Of course, we have to eat. We don't have to take cocaine or gamble to live. But perhaps these ultra-processed carbohydrates that we're eating so much of are hijacking basic reward centers that are there for a reason and driving craving. If this area lights up, it's one thing to be hungry. But if your craving center, which has to do with your motivation and saliency, if that lights up too, while you're hungry, it's game over. You know, the likelihood of your saying no to that 500-calorie bear claw sitting in au bon pain, no, shouldn't, some unnamed pastry store, you know, that's going to be very low. All right. We took a little digression to animals because for them you can control all of the factors in a way that you can't with humans, environmental factors. So here we gave rats identical diets again, same protein, fat, carbohydrate, just with fast or slow-acting carbohydrate. And we further kept their weights the same by controlled feeding. And you'll see that the two groups over 18 weeks, that would be about 10 rat years, if you care to know how to compare these things. The two groups had the same body weight. But to keep the body weight the same, we had to begin restricting calories in the fast-acting carb group. They were eating fewer calories, but gaining the same weight. If we let them eat the same number of calories, they would have gained excessive weight. So that's already suggesting, like, somehow a calorie is not a calorie. from a metabolic perspective. When we looked, we found that the animals at the same weight had 70% more fat. And since they were the same weight, they had a commensurate reduction in lean tissue. Now I'm going to show you one graphic slide. I'm glad that this is before lunch. So these two animals weigh the same. This animal got the low glycemic index, slow-acting carb diet. This one got the fast-acting. The high GI animal's belly was filled with the highest risk fat, and so it had a lot less lean tissue. Now, there's no way that this finding can be explained by the conventional calorie in, calorie out model. This animal would have gained too much weight. So we did exactly what was told by the conventional model, which is cut back calorie intake. And despite that, it was in an extremely high-risk metabolic state. This animal had sky-high cardiovascular disease risk factors. Let's return to humans now to see if there's an indication that this happens over a longer period of time than just one meal. So here we looked at 21 obese young adults studied for 7 months. We brought their weight down by 10 to 15% to stress their body. We know that their hunger is going to go up and their metabolism is going to drop. And then we put them on one of 3 diets, and this was done randomly, but everybody got all 3 diets for a month. Either a standard low-fat diet, or at the other extreme, an Atkins very low-carb diet with a whopping 60% fat, and a low glycemic index sort of Mediterranean diet in the middle, 40-40. So this slide shows what happened to their calorie expenditure. This is a marker for how their metabolism's running. Before the weight loss, they were burning off on average about a little more than 3,200 calories a day. These are big people, overweight or obese. On the low-fat diet, their energy expenditure plummeted by more than 400 calories a day. On the low-carb diet, despite the weight loss, same amount of weight loss on these 2 diets, this was a weight maintenance phase, there was actually no significant decline in calorie expenditure at all. It was as if the body didn't know it was starving on this low-carb diet. This difference of 325 calories a day, again, that is the whole obesity epidemic, if it were persistent over the long term. The low glycemic index diet was in the middle. Now, I want to step back and take a look briefly at, or reflect upon, how we've come to this notion that all calories are alike. And it's based on hundreds of clinical trials that compare one diet to another that are in theory different, and finding basically no difference in body weight. Low carb, high carb, Atkins, paleo, whatever. Overall, a study published in JAMA last summer kind of looked at this. They did what's called a network analysis. And they said, when you look at all these hundreds of studies, it's basically, they said that in technical terms. The problem is, these studies, how do I say this without sounding arrogant? They have strong methodological limitations. That's how to say it. Because these studies would never fly as drug studies, where there's all sorts of measures to ensure that the subjects get the drug, they take it properly, you get good discrimination between the groups. 95% of these studies that say, were counseling studies where they tell people, what to eat. You guys eat this, you guys eat that. Maybe you meet with a dietitian for a couple of weeks, and then maybe once a month for a few more months, and then you're off to do it yourself. How do you do that in our toxic environment? We know that there's overwhelming difficulty with behavior change. So people don't change their behavior very much. They wind up eating very much the same diet regardless of treatment assignment, and guess what? Their weight doesn't change very much. But that doesn't mean that diets don't matter, that dietary composition doesn't matter. It just means we need better designed studies. And fortunately, there are a few that are beginning to appear. And I want to just feature this one, which is the direct study, 300 obese adults, studied for 2 years. But here, this was done in Israel at a work site where it was kind of like America in the 1950s. You go to work, you eat lunch in the company cafeteria, and in Israel, the main meal is done in midday. So you could really actually change behavior because you're feeding people. And basically what they found was the low-carb diet produced substantially more weight loss than the low-fat diet, which was out floating in the Dead Sea somewhere off the coast of Israel. And then we had the Mediterranean diet, which was a little slower starter, but it fully caught up. So this may be more like the turtle than the hare. Okay, let me just start to bring this all together. So we've talked about an alternative model in which the problem is with the fat cells. They've been triggered to suck in too many calories by all of the processed carbohydrate. And that's left too few, not too many calories in the bloodstream. If you just cut back and eat less, you're only going to make the situation worse. And you're not going to be able to keep the weight off because biology is going to fight back against you. And in the battle between mind and metabolism, metabolism usually wins. But in addition to dietary carbohydrate, there are other aspects of the diet that are important. Protein has some interesting hormonal effects because it causes secretion of glucagon that counterbalances insulin. And the vegetarian proteins are especially interesting in this regard because they have more arginine to lysine, and that leads to relatively more glucagon and less insulin. Protein does cause insulin secretion too, so a 20-ounce steak is going to be a problem in this model. But more moderate amounts of protein, but I don't mean the minimum either. I think that we do need more protein than the biological minimum, to be able to survive. But I think more protein is helpful, not massive amounts. Maybe 20%, 25%. 25% might be good for weight loss, with perhaps an emphasis on vegetarian, although that needs to be more researched. Fatty acid profile, micronutrients, the vitamins and minerals, all that stuff that gets removed during food processing influences fat cells. And as we're discovering, prebiotics, probiotics, the gut microbiome plays this really critical role in communicating directly with fat cells to keep them under control. We don't want our fat cells, we want our fat cells to be cooperating with the rest of the body. We don't want them running the show. And then lastly, let's not neglect sleep, stress, and physical activity, which also influences fat cells. Physical activity, not so much by burning off calories. If it was just burning off calories, you could sweat it out on a treadmill for 20 minutes and then completely undo that with literally a handful of raisins. The benefit of physical activity is burning off calories if you push those levels really high, but for everybody, even at moderate levels, it improves metabolism and lowers insulin levels. Here's a pyramid that we've produced to reflect this, with fruits, vegetables, and legumes at the base. No limitations at all on oils. They should be encouraged. We'll come back to this in a second. Grain products in their least processed state. Okay, so let me just summarize. I've got 2 minutes left, so I think we're going to be good. The conventional approach to weight loss, the calorie-restricted diet, has poor efficacy in an environment with unlimited calories availability. Alternative approaches aim to calm down fat cells and lead to weight loss with ad libitum conditions, people just eating naturally and regulating their own weight. Calorie labeling is important, not as a way to reduce calorie intake, but as a way to avoid overconsumption of highly processed foods for which we can't actually understand what those ingredients might be and how they might affect the body. So I think it's important to label packaged foods. It's not important, and we shouldn't be labeling a bowl of berries. From a public health perspective, the focus should be placed on food quality without attempts to diminish portion sizes of healthy foods, even if they're calorie rich. In terms of practical aspects, carbohydrate, reduce the total amount, especially the refined grains, potatoes, and added sugars. Emphasize whole foods that digest slowly, the non-starchy vegetables, fruits, legumes, pulses. Serve grains in their least processed state. We need grains. There's 7 billion people. We're not going to be able to, all live as paleo. But those grains need to be minimally processed. Steel-cut oats rather than instant oats, even flourless breads or stone ground breads over traditional breads. Limit added sugars to 25 grams a day, primarily desserts after balanced meals. Avoid sugary beverages. Use fats liberally. And we know that the monos and polys are, we've heard, to be encouraged. And I didn't have time to show you the studies of fat cells and mono and polyunsaturated fats, but they like them. Fat cells like these fats. It helps them calm down. Protein, we talked about. Prebiotics, probiotics. Encourage consumption of truly fermented foods, like yogurt, pickles, and the like. And then in my last slide, I want to say that these ideas I presented to you may be provocative, but they're not new. The editors of a leading journal wrote the following. When we read that the fat woman has the remedy in her own hands, or rather between her own teeth, there is an implication that obesity is merely the result of unsatisfactory dietary bookkeeping. Although logic suggests that body fat may be decreased by altering the balance sheet through diminished intake or increased output or both, the problem is not really so simple and uncomplicated as it is pictured. And these words were written by the editors of JAMA in 1924. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, David. Good here, thank you. So we have just a minute or two for questions, and you've painted a pretty alarming picture of the situation that we're in and where we're heading and some of the factors that are behind that. So we've got an action-oriented bunch in the room here. What is one or two things that culinary professionals can do right now to address the importance of calorie quality that you shared with us?
Can I have the slides again for a sec? I think I really just listed them. So I think I'll just go back to the summary slide. We want to, I think probably the simplest way to think about this is through food processing. Now, no, all food processing is not bad. Cooking was a food processing technology that dates back probably 500,000 years. We've evolved with food technology. That has allowed us to become humans with smaller digestive tracts and bigger brains because we don't have to put so much energy into digesting our foods. But there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. So we want processing to serve public health interests and not private profit. The creation of chocolate Cocoa Puffs and Fruit Loops, fruit spelled with F-R-O-O-T, I think. This is a form of processing that has never before existed in human evolution. And most of us, our bodies are unable to manage this. We absorb these foods, if we want to use that term to describe them, in the very first few feet of the digestive tract, our digestive tract that's like 30 feet long. When things get absorbed so quickly, they lead to a surge. We have too much for about an hour after we eat, and then too little later because it's all gotten sucked up in fat cells. So we need to back off on food processing and use food processing to enhance nutritional quality in light of basic understanding of human biology. And there are ways, like for example, processing technology could be great. Let's use nitrogen packaging to preserve polyunsaturated fats, which are labile. They're susceptible to oxidation. That's why trans fats, one of the reasons why trans fats was so popular by the industry. It was not only more like butter in its solidity at room temperature, but it was shelf stable indefinitely. Whereas the vegetable oils that had polyunsaturated fats got rancid after a while. But if we pack processed foods and nitrogen, that's going to protect them. There are many other examples of that the food industry can use technology, again, to enhance nutritional value rather than just to create foods that have limitless shelf life and enhance the profits.
Thank you so much. I think that's all the time we have for questions, so please join me in giving Dr. Ludwig a very warm round of applause.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So before we break for lunch, I want to emphasize how much your feedback matters to us here with the Menus of Change initiative. And we ask that you all take just a few minutes to complete the evaluation. There are hard copies available outside at the hospitality desk. However, given how much we all value sustainability, we encourage you all to complete the evaluation in your app or online. And the URL is posted in a slide that's on the monitors during the break. But in case anyone has a pen, it's tinyurl.com/menusofchange15. With that, we have a wonderful lunch prepared for you if your appetite hasn't been spoiled by Dr. Ludwig's photo. It's going to be a walk-around lunch downstairs. Then we'll meet back here in 1 hour for our closing presentation. So we'll see you all back here at 1 o'clock. Thank you so much.